Imagine being 14 years old, your hands torn open, your spine permanently bent, knowing that if you miss even one arrow, you might not survive. This wasn't fantasy, this was the real life of medieval archers, where being a hero was never a choice. From as young as 6 or 7, boys were forced to train every week, stretching monstrous longbows that weighed 100 to 180 pounds, slowly deforming their bodies forever, fingers bleeding, shoulders cracking, pain becoming normal because commanders only gave one order: shoot or die. They wore no real armor, just cloth and leather, and if the enemy reached them, it wasn't a fight, it was slaughter, all while standing knee-deep in mud, freezing rain soaking their bows, hunger eating them alive, firing up to 10 arrows a minute and watching people fall with every shot, carrying trauma with no name because PTSD didn't exist, and most of them were dead before 30. Yet they still stood in line, fully aware their future was short. Which leaves one uncomfortable question. When we struggle with the smallest discomfort today, could we really survive a life that was trained in hell while ours was built in comfort? You think the worst part of being a medieval archer was the battle, the arrows, the blood, the screaming. But that was only the beginning, because when the fighting stopped, the real punishment started. And this is the part history rarely shows you, the part no movie ever slows down for. The moment when the survivors realized that living was sometimes worse than dying. When a battle ended, knights were counted, nobles were rescued, commanders were praised, but archers were left exactly where they stood, exhausted, shaking, half-broken, surrounded by bodies they helped create. And if you were wounded, there was no medic rushing toward you, no clean bandage, no painkillers, because medieval medicine didn't care how brave you were. It only cared whether your body could still function, and most of the time, it couldn't. An arrow cut didn't need to be deep to kill you, it just needed to get dirty, because infection was the real executioner of the Middle Ages, slow, invisible, unstoppable, turning small wounds into death sentences. And archers were especially vulnerable because their hands were always open, cracked, bleeding, their fingers constantly torn by bowstrings soaked in sweat, mud and blood, meaning even a tiny scratch could rot your arm from the inside. And once that rot started, there was no stopping it.
If you survived the wounds, you still had to survive the aftermath, because armies didn't rest in warm camps with clean food.
They slept in fields, forests and ruins, soaked by rain, eaten alive by insects, drinking water that made you sicker than your wounds ever did. And archers, already underfed and physically destroyed, were the first ones to collapse, not from enemy blades, but from fever, dysentery, and sheer exhaustion. And here's the part that hurts the most. If an archer became too weak to draw his bow, he wasn't reassigned, he wasn't protected, he wasn't honored, he was replaced. Because medieval armies didn't invest in people, they invested in outcomes. And an archer who couldn't shoot was just extra weight, another mouth to feed, another problem waiting to die on the roadside. Many of them didn't even make it home, not because they were killed in battle, but because their bodies simply gave up on the march back, collapsing somewhere between victory and survival, buried in shallow graves or not buried at all. Their names never written down, their lives erased as if they had never existed. But suppose you did make it home. Suppose your legs carried you back to your village, broken spine, ruined shoulder, hands permanently twisted from years of pulling the bow. What awaited you wasn't gratitude, it wasn't honor, it wasn't a hero's welcome. Because medieval society didn't celebrate broken men, it depended on strong ones, and once your strength was gone, your value disappeared with it. Most archers returned unable to farm properly, unable to lift tools, unable to work like normal men, and without work, there was no food, no income, no protection, which meant many former archers ended their lives begging, stealing, or slowly starving, surrounded by people who benefited from their sacrifice but never truly acknowledged it. And the pain never left them, not at night, not in old age, if they even reached old age, because their bodies were permanently reshaped by violence. Bones thickened unnaturally, joints fused incorrectly, spines locked into painful curves, turning simple movements into daily agony, and there was no rest from it, no escape, no retirement, just years of quiet suffering that no one recorded. Then there was the part no one talks about at all, the memories, because archers didn't fight face to face like knights, they killed at distance, watching human beings fall like targets, one after another. And even though medieval people didn't have words like trauma or PTSD, their minds still carried the weight, replaying screams, faces, final moments, again and again in silence, because admitting weakness was dangerous in a world that respected only survival. Some archers drank when they could, not for pleasure, but to silence their thoughts. Others became aggressive, withdrawn, unstable, and many simply stopped speaking about the war altogether, locking their experiences away because there was no place for that kind of truth in medieval society. And yet, this is where the story turns. Despite all of this, despite the suffering, the damage, the short lives, medieval archers were still feared, still respected, still strategically essential, because their effectiveness changed the course of history, proving that power didn't always come from armor or noble blood, but from discipline, endurance, and brutal repetition. Kings relied on them, generals built entire strategies around them, battles were won because of them, and entire empires shifted because thousands of anonymous archers stood in mud and rain, drawing bows that slowly destroyed their bodies, firing arrows until their fingers failed, and even then, picking them back up again. That's the contradiction at the heart of their story. They were both disposable and indispensable, ignored as individuals, but unstoppable as a force, suffering in silence while shaping the world in ways they would never live long enough to understand. So, when we look back today, sitting comfortably, watching history through screens, talking about toughness, discipline, and resilience, we have to ask ourselves something honestly uncomfortable. Could we endure a life where pain wasn't temporary, where survival wasn't guaranteed, where your body was sacrificed piece by piece for a cause that would forget your name the moment you were gone? Because medieval archers didn't just fight wars, they paid for history with their bodies. And the reason their story feels so distant, so unreal, is because modern life has removed us from the kind of suffering that once defined strength, leaving us to admire it from a safe distance without ever having to live it. And that is the real legacy of medieval archers. Not the arrows, not the victories, not the battles, but the reminder that the world we inherited was built by people who endured conditions we struggle even to imagine. And if we're honest with ourselves, most of us wouldn't last a week in the life they were forced to survive. If you think medieval archers feared death in battle the most, that's where you're wrong. Because the one thing that terrified them more than arrows, swords, or starvation was capture. Since being taken alive as an archer didn't mean imprisonment, ransom, or negotiation. It meant execution, often immediate, often brutal, and sometimes performed in front of everyone as a warning. Knights were valuable, nobles were currency. Soldiers could be exchanged, but archers were considered tools. And when tools broke or fell into enemy hands, they weren't spared, because archers didn't just kill enemies, they humiliated them, tearing through armor, horses, and formations that were supposed to be invincible. And medieval elites never forgave that kind of power coming from peasants. That's why many armies gave unofficial orders. If you capture an archer, don't keep him, don't question him, don't feed him, just kill him. Because letting archers live meant letting the nightmare return in the next war. And this fear wasn't imagined. It was earned through decades of battles where arrows turned noble blood into mud. Some archers knew this so well that they carried knives not for fighting but for themselves, because in certain moments, dying by your own hand was considered better than what waited for you if captured. And that alone should tell you how hopeless their position could become when the line broke. And when archers were executed, it wasn't always quick, because medieval warfare didn't just aim to kill bodies, it aimed to crush morale. So hangings were public, mutilations were deliberate, hands were cut off to make sure bows could never be drawn again, fingers were smashed, shoulders shattered, messages carved into flesh so survivors would spread fear before the next battle even began. There are records of victorious armies lining captured archers up and killing them one by one, while knights watched, not because it was necessary, but because it felt justified. Because archers broke the rules of honorable war, killing from distance, denying heroic combat, reducing armored elites to targets instead of champions. This hatred followed archers even when they weren't fighting, because villagers feared them, nobles distrusted them, and rulers used them while quietly preparing to discard them, knowing that the same men who defended the kingdom could one day become dangerous if angered, unpaid, or desperate. And sometimes that fear became reality. When wages were delayed or promises broken, bands of unemployed archers didn't return quietly to farming because many could no longer farm at all, so they drifted, armed, skilled, hardened by violence, forming outlaw groups, mercenary bands, or simply disappearing into forests where law barely existed, and when authorities caught them, punishment was swift because a trained archer outside royal control was seen as a threat, not a man. Executions weren't rare, they were policy, meant to remind everyone that power flowed one way only, from crown to subject. and that even the most effective warrior could be erased the moment he stopped being useful. Yet here's the cruel irony. Despite knowing all of this, despite understanding that capture meant death and survival meant poverty, archers still fought with terrifying discipline, standing their ground longer than logic would allow, firing until the last possible second, because running didn't guarantee safety either, and fear became just another thing they learned to live with. And that kind of fear changes a person permanently. You don't live your entire youth knowing that defeat means torture and death, without it reshaping how you think, how you trust, how you feel. And medieval archers became emotionally hardened, not because they wanted to be, but because softness was a liability, something the world punished immediately. They laughed less, spoke less, expected less from life, and many stopped imagining a future entirely, focusing only on the next command, the next battle, the next day survived, because hope was dangerous when the system you lived in was designed to consume you. This is why medieval archers rarely left memoirs, poems, or heroic tales, because their lives didn't leave space for reflection, only endurance, and the silence they left behind is one of the loudest truths in history. So when people romanticize medieval warfare, talking about honor, glory, and courage, they're usually talking about knights, banners, and kings, not the men who stood behind them, knowing that if the tide turned, no one would spare them, no one would ransom them, and no song would remember them. And that brings us to the final realization, the one that hurts the most. Medieval archers weren't just fighting the enemy in front of them. They were fighting a system that never intended for them to survive long enough to matter as individuals, only as numbers, as volleys, as statistics written in victory records that never recorded their names. They endured a life where mercy was rare, safety was temporary, and death was always closer than dignity. And the fact that they still stood their ground, still fired, still obeyed orders, tells us something uncomfortable about human endurance, that people can survive almost anything, even when survival offers no reward beyond staying alive one more day. So the real question isn't whether medieval archers were strong, we already know they were, but whether modern humans, raised on comfort, protection, and choice, could mentally survive a world where mercy didn't exist, where fear was constant, and where your life was only worth the damage you could inflict before it ended. When you strip away the armor, the banners, and the myths, what medieval archers really leave behind is a warning, not a legend, because their lives prove that history is not built by comfort or glory, but by people who were pushed far beyond human limits and never given the luxury of choice. Men whose bodies were shaped by pain, whose minds were hardened by fear, and whose names vanished the moment their usefulness ended. And when we compare that world to ours, where discomfort feels like injustice and struggle feels optional, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth that modern strength is mostly theoretical, because we admire endurance without practicing it. We celebrate sacrifice without understanding its cost, and we speak about resilience while living lives designed to avoid it, which doesn't make us weak but does make us distant from the kind of raw survival that once defined humanity. And maybe that distance is progress, maybe it's mercy, but it also means that if we were dropped into their world, hungry, unprotected, forgotten, we wouldn't fail because we lack courage. We would fail because the world that forged medieval archers no longer exists, leaving us with their story not as inspiration, but as a reminder of how brutal survival once was, and how easily history forgets the people who endured it so the rest of us wouldn't have to. And maybe the most unsettling part of all is that medieval archers didn't think of themselves as extraordinary, because to them this life wasn't a test of toughness or a story worth telling. It was simply normal, a world where pain arrived early, choices were few, and survival demanded obedience more than courage, which means the real difference between us and them isn't strength or weakness, but expectation, because we expect safety, fairness, and meaning, while they expected loss, hardship, and silence. And when you realize that, you stop asking whether you could survive their life and start understanding why you were never meant to, because progress didn't just give us comfort. It removed us from the kind of suffering that once shaped human beings at their core, leaving medieval archers behind as a forgotten foundation, men who absorbed brutality so future generations could inherit stability. And the tragedy is that the more comfortable the world becomes, the easier it is to overlook the cost that built it, until their endurance feels unreal, their pain feels exaggerated, and their lives feel distant, even though everything we stand on was bought with stories just like theirs. And if history feels silent about medieval archers, that silence is the point, Because systems built on survival rarely stop to say thank you. They move forward and leave the broken behind, which means the true legacy of these men isn't found in museums or battle maps, but in absence, in the missing names, the unmarked graves, the generations that lived safer lives without ever knowing why. And maybe that's the final irony, that the people who endured the most are remembered the least, while those who inherited the comfort debate strength from a distance. And when you really sit with that thought, you realize this story was never about arrows or wars at all. It was about how easily human suffering becomes invisible once it stops being necessary, and how progress, for all its benefits, quietly erases the faces of those who paid its price, leaving us with one last uncomfortable responsibility: not to glorify their pain, not to romanticize their lives, but to remember that the world we call normal was built on conditions we would never accept, by people who were never asked whether they could survive, only how much they could endure before disappearing. And once you truly understand the life of a medieval archer, the question stops being, could you survive their world, and becomes, would you even recognize yourself in it? Because survival back then wasn't about passion, self-expression, or fulfillment. It was about endurance without applause, obedience without reassurance, and pain without explanation. And when you place that reality beside modern life, where identity is built around comfort, choice, and meaning, you realize that the men who stood in mud drawing bows weren't just physically different from us. They were shaped by a mindset that no longer exists, one where suffering was expected and silence was strength. And maybe the reason their story feels so heavy is because it forces us to accept that progress didn't just change technology, it changed what it means to be human, leaving us safer, freer, and longer lived, but also far removed from the raw resilience that once defined survival. And in that distance lies both our greatest achievement and our quiet vulnerability. Because if comfort ever disappears, we won't be returning to their strength. We'll be facing its absence for the first time. And when you look back on all of it, the exhaustion, the hunger, the endless pain, the fear of capture, the silent deaths, the unrecorded names, you realize that medieval archers weren't just warriors. They were the backbone of survival itself, forced into a life that demanded everything and gave almost nothing. And their story forces us to confront a truth modern life often hides: that endurance, discipline, and courage were once measured in days survived, not medals earned. And while we sit comfortably, debating resilience or complaining about minor hardships, they were living a reality where every sunrise was a test, every arrow fired a gamble with life itself. And maybe the most haunting lesson isn't how strong they were, but how invisible their suffering became to history, leaving us with a question we can't answer without discomfort. When the world stops demanding survival, what happens to the human spirit? And are we ready to face a life where comfort vanishes and endurance alone decides who lives?